family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about step 7 in our first legacy of recovery, and I am just crazy excited to have my special guest with us today, Clif G. Clif, please introduce yourself and tell our listeners where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little about how you got to AA.
Thanks, Rick. Hey, I'm Clif G. I'm an alcoholic. My home group is the Altered Boys here in Oklahoma City. My sobriety date is August the 15th of 2001. And for that short amount of time, I'm just as grateful as I know how to be. And I want to really thank you for inviting me first to come on and be a part of this. It's just a really good project. And so thank you so much. I wandered into Alcoholics Anonymous on August the 15th, 01, because I had a problem. It was not drinking. My problem was I'd been kicked out of the house and I needed to get back in. And that's why I wandered into AA. And, on that particular date, I happened to be given the gift of desperation, and a fellow talked to me in a way that I'd never been able to hear before, and gave me the music of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I found my way here. And, the one thing that's happened to me since that day to this, Rick, I've never left. And I think that's the biggest miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous, that I've never left. I've wanted to, and I swore I would. I'd tell Lori, my wife, I'm not going back. And she'd say, okay, I'll tell them. And I'd say, oh, no, don't do that. So anyway, that's how I wound up here.
Well, and for every single person who has ever been touched by your experience, been touched by the commitment and dedication you have to Alcoholics Anonymous and sharing our message with the still suffering, we are grateful. We are grateful you stayed. All right. So thanks so much. Welcome. Glad that you're here. We're going to jump right into it. The very first thing I want to do is I want to read a quick snippet from the foreword of the 12 in 12. And it says this: AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which, if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. And the reason that I love reading that whenever we're doing anything on the steps is because I think it's one of the best, very brief definitions that Bill ever wrote about what are the 12 steps, right? What can I expect from them? What do I get from them? And how often. I love the if practiced as a way of life, right? Because I don't know about you, but when I first started really kind of beginning to look at the steps, I wasn't 100% sure that I really needed to do all that work. I thought y'all would do the work and I could just sit back and let it seep in through osmosis, right? But I have learned in my 34 years that it is true that if practiced as a way of life, it can expel the obsession to drink, but more importantly, it can enable me, the sufferer, to become happily whole on the inside and externally whole on the outside. So I love that definition. What I want to also do is I also want to read the actual steps. Since we're here to talk about step 7, I want to read it. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. And the spiritual principle that is underlying this particular step is, as I like to use it, is humility. And when I'm taking a newcomer, or anyone for that matter, through this step, oftentimes I will I've created for the step study on Take the 12, kind of the one thing that you need to know about this step. And for me, the one thing that I learned the most was that humility heals my pain. And I'm probably going to share a story with you at some point while we're talking, but about that. But I wanted to ask you the first question of why, when I asked you to do this and you said yes, and then we were trying to determine which of the 36 you could plug into, why did you say yes to speaking on this step?
I think, well, I think, first of all, that reading, I love it, by the way. I have that on a piece of, I put it on a Post-it note. I copied it out of the 12 and posted it I just have it in the front of my big book because I just love that. And I jumped on this because I think it's those kind of middle steps are the ones that sometimes nobody really wants to talk about. They're difficult, I think, for some people to talk about. And I have found that 6, 7, talking about 7, so we'll try to stick to that. Sometimes I can't help but intertwine them a little bit, but
totally agree.
I get. I find that this is where a vast majority of the mining from 10 and 11, I do all my mining from step 7, that my spiritual sobriety continues to rest through 10 and 11 because of 6 and 7. And I find this is what drives me to seek and continue to find humility, surrender, but also emotional sobriety. I think as we rock along, I remember, Rick, when I was first in the book and my sponsor was taking me through it, when we turned the pages to 76 and you look and you got 2 paragraphs, 6 and 7, of course, taking 2 paragraphs. And I thought, my gosh, the Holy Grail. We spent 75 pages. We spend so much time on step 1, rightly so, 2, 3, and here we are, we get to page 76 and we got 2 paragraphs. I mean, this is like the free space on the bingo card, for God's sakes. I mean, for sure. we pray and then we ask, and I think, well, this is a piece of cake. I'm just moving on. But what I have found for me, this is the gold mine on having what you talked about, this to be usefully whole and to also be of service outside, beyond Alcoholics Anonymous. I have to be aware of these step 7, my continued need to turn to God to ask for removal, to continue to ask for help. And if I want to have emotional sobriety, and looking at 10 and 11, daily practice of those helps me upturn those things in 7, which are causing me blockage, which are causing me continued problems. I
completely agree. Go ahead.
I also like, and because I have it written in my book, humility, because you talked about this step. There's a piece in the 12 and 12 on page 58, which I wrote in my book on it. It says, and I love this, Bill's definition of humility: a clear recognition of what and who we really are, followed by a sincere attempt to become what we could be. And that that embodies step 7, these pieces of what am I trying to be? I mean, I got to recognize who and what I am, which is I'm alcoholic and I am powerless. And this idea of, what am I? What's my attempt to become what I could be? I know you and I both, we didn't get sober to hide out in AA.
That's right.
We get sober, as the book talks about, to be a demonstration, but back into the stream of life, and I can be back in the stream of life and still be a jerk.
Right.
And this step, along with continued mining through 10, 11, helps me be the person that God really intended me to be. This idea of humility, that in and of myself, I cannot, I can no more get rid of selfishness than I could get rid of my drinking.
And we're actually going to unpack that particular statement
Yeah, good,
a
good,
little bit more in just a moment. I
good.
want to back up to something that you kind of alluded to a little bit, and I think it is something that is worth putting an exclamation mark on. In our big book, step 6 and step 7 are a single paragraph apiece. And there are, I love how you called it the free space on the bingo card. There are some people that would look at that and say, well, it's only a paragraph, and therefore it doesn't carry the depth and weight that some of the other steps that we have do. And I have to tell you that 6 and 7 have become, and particularly 7, and I'll just a little disclaimer here, step 7 has been, since I was 13 years sober, my favorite step. And hopefully get the chance to tell you why. But I believe that 6 and 7 are the meat and substance of our program. While all 12 steps are important and all 12 steps have their place, and they all, I must actively take all of them on a daily basis. If I don't have a personal relationship with 6 and 7, if I am not willing constantly to look at those defects of character that continue to cause my failure, even in long-term sobriety, and recognize that I don't have the skill set to be able to remove them myself, and in 7, ask God, become ready to have them removed, and in 7, ask God to remove them, I am not going to have that personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism that's talked about in the appendix on page 567. So I want to go back, and I want to just, you had kind of alluded to the fact that sometimes people, we just don't talk about it near enough. I don't hear it talked about, step 6 and 7, in meetings. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think you spotted on it right there. We give it, I think, and again, I'm not trying to broad paint, but you've nailed it. We don't talk much about it. And I think a big piece of that is people believe, well, I'm working. Have you heard them say this to me? Well, I'm working on my defects. I think there's some misconception about 6 and 7. And again, I'm sorry, I know we're talking about 7, but sometimes
I listen, Cliff, I agree. They totally go together. And here's the reason why. In the same way that I believe that 4 is the prep step for 5,
Yep.
I believe 6 is the prep step for 7, and I believe that 8 is the prep step for 9. And so they absolutely go together.
Okay.
So knock yourself out.
I got you. So, I think sometimes looking at the prep step, that's a great way to say it. I got to look at step 6 and see what it really, in the book, what it really says. And it talks about, have these become objectionable?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I have to be to get ready in 6, because that's my job, to get ready.
Right.
Have they become objectionable?
They being
Defects.
The defects. Thank you.
And so if they do, so when they are, then we humbly ask. Mm-hmm. And I believe, and again, I hear people saying, I'm working on my honesty. I'm working on my sex conduct. And I think, I bet you are, you horny little SOB, working on your sex conduct. But it's that idea that I somehow believe I have the power to remove or vanquish these defects. And I think sometimes that's what I hear, but we don't hear much about it. And so I think it's more perhaps of course, I think everything goes back to sponsorship, but I believe a piece of this is a lack of really understanding what we're really doing here, and understanding powerlessness begins and it continues. I don't suddenly magically at step 5 be vested with power that now that I have to vanquish my lying, my cheating, my stealing.
Right. Well, okay. So I tend to agree with what you're saying, but if I remember, so I admitted I was powerless in one.
Yep.
I came to believe in a new power in two, and it specifically says in our literature in three that a new power flows into us.
Yes.
However, I don't get to have that power become me.
Yes.
It
Correct.
is that power is a power greater than myself. It is God as I understand God, right? So as I move forward, you're absolutely right. I while I don't have the power in and of myself, there is a power out there that can remove them from me. I remember
Yes.
I was talking one time to my sponsor, and uh, I I was crispy about something. I don't remember what it was, but I'm so grateful that I have a relationship with my sponsor that goes like this. He doesn't want to hear the stuff of my day when I call. What he wants to hear is my inventory.
Yeah.
And so he's like, he's oftentimes he'll say, okay, so, what's your inventory for the day? What is the noise that's going on between your left ear and your right ear? Not about the stuff that's going on in your day, but about your thoughts, feelings, and emotions about the stuff, right? And I remember whatever it was, I don't even remember what it was that I was calling him about this particular day. I remember being very frustrated with his answers. And towards the end of the phone call, I remember saying to him, well, okay, fine, I'll just work on that. And he started cracking up laughing. And I'm like, what are you laughing at? He said, I am laughing at the belief that you have the power to, and I'm doing air quotes for our
Yes.
listeners,
Yes.
work on that, right? You do not have the power to work on that, dude. That is way above your pay grade. You do not have the skill sets for that.
Precisely.
And I'll never forget that.
Yeah. And I think some people get tangled in that, and they get fostered a belief, because we can have new old ideas in AA. We can get a new old idea about what
Right.
this looks like. They get a new old idea that somehow they have the ability, and maybe they're speaking that, but meaning, I've got to go to God. But I don't always believe that. I believe they have somehow they can work on this, which sounds like therapy, which AA is not, of course.
Correct.
And so I think, going way back to the question, was that I just think that we don't hear a lot about it because people have some misunderstandings about it.
Right. And I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that I'm grateful that we're here today, is to be able
Yes.
to shed some light on it, so that maybe we can create some identification for others to be able to go, oh, you know what? I was thinking that exact same thing, or I have felt that, or I have done that, or maybe I should think about looking at it this way, right?
Right.
I also, you had also gave a beautiful definition. Was it on page 58
Yes. From the 12.
of
Yes. Yes.
humility? And
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I have also used what at least I call another one of Bill's definitions of humility out of the 12 and 12 on page 72 in step 7, in that second paragraph, the end of that second paragraph, where he says that basic ingredient of all humility, a desire to seek and do God's will, was missing. And for me, to me, in my brain, a basic ingredient is a good, at least a good component of, or a definition of, humility. And so when I'm taking a sponsee through the steps, and we get to step 7, I actually have an exercise that I'm going to talk a little bit about in a moment,
Sure.
that I have some experience with on step 7, that was given to me by actually someone I didn't like very much, but changed my life. And it basically identified this idea that humility, if I can reframe how I approach this word humility, because if you look up the word humility in the dictionary, it's got some beautiful definitions, and all of them good. But for this alcoholic, the idea of humility is removing my belief that I've got power away from whatever the circumstance is, and have a desire to seek and do God's will in all things.
Yes.
Right. And so
Yes.
I have adopted that as a definition for humility. But I think that under this conversation of why don't we hear more people talking about it in the rooms, I think you're absolutely right. People just don't get it.
I think that's a huge piece of it. And I think a huge piece of that is unpacked if you really study the literature. And I know you're a big book disciple, you're a book study guy. And so
Absolutely.
we're talking to a couple of people here who believe that you ought to read the book 7, 8 times and then start studying it. Right. That they're just always in the book. And I have a book study here on Tuesday night at my house, and I'm always in the book because I think that's where it is. I think a piece of this is understanding 6, that I have to find the things objectionable to be ready to ask. I think that's number one. And so how do I find them objectionable? I got to get enough pain.
There you go.
I mean, I got to be in enough pain, and pain today is not necessarily the physical pain I might see. Oftentimes that comes by seeing the pain that I'm causing in the people I love the most eyes. I can't stand that anymore. I can tolerate a lot more physical pain, but when I begin to see the emotional pain I'm creating in my wife, in my friends, that's when I begin to see these things as an objectionable. Right. Because I'm kind of cowboy tough. I stayed out there a long time. I like to think I am anyway. but I'm not very tough today because AA has softened me, right? I mean, I think that's a big piece for guys like you and I who think we're really tough.
Right.
We come here and these steps soften us. They begin to change us. They change the nature of our character. 6 and 7 this is where we change. This is where we change. This is where we take some hard looks at who we are, look at some of these old ideas, men don't cry, that we dug out probably in 4. Right. We talked about them in 5. They've become objectionable, saying that's not true anymore.
That's right.
And so we're going to quit acting that's true, because that causes me pain. To operate under an old idea that men don't cry causes me pain. It cuts me off from things. Whatever those old ideas are, they cut me off. They now become objectionable because ideas like that cause me to act certain ways. They cause me to. I remember sitting in an AA meeting, and the first time I saw a man cry in an AA meeting, I got really uncomfortable because men don't cry.
Right.
That old idea creates prejudices in me that causes me to act on my defects of character. Right. I shut people off. I build walls. Those are all defects.
Absolutely.
And I act with indifference. I heard one time that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. I become indifferent to it, just indifferent. Hate is an emotion, right? I got something, but indifference is you don't exist. Right. And so when those defects come that operate out of those old ideas, I can get a lot of meat out of that when I begin to see pain, emotional pain, and what I'm causing other people. I begin to find those objectionable. So I think there's some misunderstanding about objectionability. And so I got to know that.
We absolutely do have to know that. And I think I hope one of the biggest takeaways from our conversation today is that as we identify all of the causes and conditions of our failure, right, in 4, share it with someone else in 5, become entirely ready to have it removed in 6, that I simply do not have the ability to remove them myself, regardless of how strong I think I am, regardless of how intelligent I think I am. I mean, because, I came to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous thinking that, my life's pretty good. I'm smart, I'm intelligent, I'm talented, I'm pretty good looking, I have above average earning potential, I'm nice to small animals, all of these things that helped my insanity believe that my life is pretty good. But the reality is that when I sit down and take stock of all of those things that were the cause of my failure, because we learned in step 1, alcohol is not the problem. Right. More about alcoholism. I love it. Tells us that it is my mental states, my thinking that precedes a relapse into drinking, for obviously this is the crux of the problem. Yes. And then in We Agnostics, it tells me that just 10 pages later that the solution to said problem is developing a relationship with a power greater than myself, I simply at some point have to have that profound shift that allows me to be able to surrender this belief that I can fix me. I'm not the solution. That's what I learned in step 2.
Yes.
I'm not the solution to my problem.
Yes, that's correct. And therefore I can't be the solution in step 7.
Thank you.
I cannot
Exactly. Exactly. I'm going to read, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to read just a little snippet from the step study on takethe12.org
Sure.
and I on step 7. And I just want to get your feedback on it.
Yeah.
One of the first and most important things we need to learn about our defects is that we can't be relieved of them without some level of humility. Alcoholics are victims of pride and selfishness. In the past, when we felt pain and suffering, generally as a result of said pride and selfishness, we masked it with alcohol. Before coming to AA, we used self-reliance to deal with it. Today, we can acknowledge the limits of human power in addressing these character defects. We cannot do it on our own. We cannot do it by sheer willpower. We cannot do it by our own intellect and reasoning. And although steps 6 and 7 are the shortest steps in terms of wording in our book, and are perhaps, as we've been talking about, the least discussed in meetings these days, they are probably the most potent of all 12. As we mentioned in 6, they are the meat and substance of our program. They embody the miracle of transformation as we turn over our broken, defective personalities for God to transform them into healthy, effective instruments of his will.
Bam. Let me just
Right?
bam.
Right?
Bam.
Mic
Bam.
drop.
Yeah. We're going to the house. So here's the deal. I learned early on, I'm restless, irritable, discontent. I don't know that my problem is I'm separated from God on self-will. I don't know that.
Right.
I don't know that. So before I ever drink beverage alcohol, I learned some skills. I learned to lie. I learned to cheat. I learned to steal. I learned those things because I watched, and so when somebody told the truth, they got a whipping. I thought, okay, don't tell the truth.
Right.
Because you get a whipping. Don't do that.
Exactly.
And so I build up what it looks to me like good skills to get me through life. I get here, I find out their character defects. So, and they're born out of old ideas. Don't tell the truth because you get in trouble. So don't, I got old ideas that foster all these defects of character. One of the biggest things, and you touched on it in that, was what step 3 tells us is that I'm a victim of the delusion that I can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of life if I just use all these management tools I've got.
Right.
Didn't say that, but that's what it's talking
that's
about.
great. I love that phrase.
If I only manage well, right? Then if I only manage well, I have this delusion that I'll wrest happiness. And so what have I got? I've got a hammer, and therefore the whole world looks like a nail. Bam, 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 bam. I'm just going around doing that. So I'm lying, cheating, stealing my way through life. I drink alcohol that soothes that restless, irritable, discontented, but we sober up. And so I sober up, I'm still a horse thief. Right. I haven't changed anything. I'm just a sober horse thief. I get drunk again. So we get here, and it's just like these, when people say, well, it's just 2 paragraphs, it's kind of like saying, well, the 3rd step's just a prayer. If you believe that, you're going, like the book says, you're going to struggle. Your stone is not going to be fixed in place.
That's right.
The step is so much more than just a prayer, but I also believe that through all of this, the text and through the actions we do leading us up to this spot, we get all the information needed. If we're painstaking, if we do this with half the vigor we did drinking, we get to this spot, to 6 and 7, we've got all the information we need.
That's right.
We've found causes and conditions. We are at a spot where if we've taken this action, if we've done 4, we've done actions with our sponsor in that 5th step, helping us to discern out, helping us connect the dots. We can begin to see we begin to see these defects. They help us with that. I try to help my sponsorees with these defects. Do you see where this actions you took here? You set the ball in motion to help them see, okay, help them do those inventories, say, here's my old ideas. And because of here are the actions I take, based on operating in this system, what it looks like, and I continue to hurt people. The reading you gave us was spot on, and it tagged the really small word I said. It's where we begin to change. It's the whole enchilada.
That's right. And you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. We've heard over the years, we've heard the steps, certain ones of them broken out, and some of them are called the maintenance steps, or we've heard them called the reflection steps. We've heard them, blah, 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 blah. I've never heard this, but as you were just talking, it just kind of hit me that on some level, 6 and 7 are the transformation steps.
Oh,
I mean, while they're all help us to transform, I know that because I do seek to have a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism, I need that change to happen so I can have a profound alteration in how I show up to life and respond to life. I can't do that if I am holding on to all that old stuff. I can't, I'm going to, what's that? I remember when I first came in, I heard I don't think it's in our literature anywhere because I haven't seen it, but I heard it a lot when I first came in, which was the same man will drink again.
Yes, that's it. If I'm not changing,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, no. If I'm not changing, the guy that walked in the door, if I just don't drink, go to meetings, I'll drink again because I haven't had the sufficient change, transformation through application. That's what Bill says. What you read the very first. Through application comes transformation.
That's right. Practicing these principles in all our affairs.
Boom. That's what happens for us.
I think one of the hardest parts for me though was really surrendering. And I wanted to talk for a moment about the idea of surrender in concert with the idea, because the question that I have written here that I wanted to ask you was, what are the biggest obstacles that you find in trying to take this step, right? With the spiritual principle being humility. What are the challenges that we incur when we get to step 7? That can at least appear to make it more difficult?
We'll take you back to the doctor's opinion for just a second.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a word here that sometimes, so we go back and look on 26 XXIX of the first pair, not full pair, first pair where it says the sense of ease and comfort. Down there, the last line in Silkworth's opinion says, this is repeated over and over, and unless this person can experience an entire psychic change, there's very little hope to the recovery. Entire, that word, we gloss over entire. I think sometimes we find reluctance in, we do the best we can. I think the first time through, and listen, if you went through the steps one time and you feel like that's all you had to do and you do 10, 11, 12, and that works for you, great. And I don't care if you call it a 10th step, 4 and 5. I think we get too hung up. And I'm one of those guys. You talk about, I'm doing my nightly inventory of step 10. I'd chase you out of the room saying, oh my God, you quit, you're killing people. That's step 11.
That's step 11, exactly.
Oh,
that's step 11.
And I'm beating them with the book. And I think, I don't care what you call it. Are you doing the exercise?
Right.
Are you doing the spiritual exercise? So, and if you're a person that says, I went through the book once, I took the steps and I've never done them again because I do 10, 11, 12, that's fine. I don't have any arguments with that. I'm a guy that I've had to do multiple inventories because and if you want to call them just 10th steps, okay. But I think we do the best we can the first pass through. And then what happens is we get into the stream of life and then these things crop up.
Right.
And we work towards the perfect idea that Silkworth talked about, an entire psychic change.
Right.
What happens, I believe, we pass through the steps, we get an awakening. We become awake, promise, tells us that in 12, right? We get a promise, a great promise, greatest promise we have. But now that I'm awake, I become aware. And I become aware of these things as I now begin to move through life. I find out that some things, maybe some old ideas on my first pass, I didn't really dig as deep, or I dug as deep as I could, but I begin to find some other things that I have in my life, or maybe I acquire some new old ideas, whatever.
I love that phrase, new old ideas.
But perhaps I begin to see some of defects in my life begin to crop up. Maybe my first pass through, I had this exhilaration with the steps, but maybe I begin to, having a small case of restless, irritable discontentedness. That happens. Mm-hmm. Not to the grade that we drink, but we begin. And so I begin to look at the short skirts. Okay. And they begin to get my attention, and I forget that I have a wife. That happens a lot in AA, right? Sure. We forget we have a significant other. They'll just we have matrimonial amnesia from time to time, and that's what happens. So, and so maybe fidelity or sex conduct becomes troublesome. And we're substituting that for our relationship with God. See, we don't understand. That's another piece. I don't understand that the activation and the acting out of my defects is substituting my surrender for God's will, substituting my surrender to move closer to the light. The more I begin to practice the defects, I'm denying God's will. I'm denying the awareness. I'm becoming insane in my defects of character.
And that right there is at least one of the obstacles, right? At some point, I need to be willing to ask myself, am I ready to give up self-reliance for reliance on a higher power?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. This is the big surrender.
It's huge. And I think that being in a place where I can finally admit that I don't have all the answers. Mm-hmm. Being in a place where I can admit that maybe those good answers might come from others. I know no human power, but I believe in good and strong and effective sponsorship. I believe in strong networks in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've heard people say that God is my ultimate sponsor. And while I just in sentiment, I love that, but I also have an earthly body.
Yep.
And I need to be able to be open and listening to the really great suggestions of those that have been doing this longer than I have, but being willing to give up my self-reliance has been one of the biggest challenges in my entire sobriety. And it doesn't matter how long I'm sober. Right. And I'm going to give you a perfect example. This is one of the stories that I wanted to share with you today. Sure. So at about 13 years sober, I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and I had gotten involved in an incredibly unhealthy and toxic relationship. Now, I know that you or none of our listeners can relate to that. Right?
Exactly.
We've never had toxic and unhealthy.
That's right. You're a snowflake.
I'm a snowflake, right? But here's the deal. I'm 13 years sober. I'm 13 years sober. So anyway, and I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but I will tell you that what it did for me was it was very clear that in that moment and for that period of time, I had made something else or someone else my higher power. And it was just sick. It was painful. There was an enormous amount of suffering that I allowed to happen in my life as a result of it. And I was working with a man in Nashville, Butch Q, and Butch, we were going to one night at our home group. He had been listening to me gripe and complain and moan about this for months and months and months. And he kept trying to guide me into the literature and give me clear-cut direction on what to do. And I simply wouldn't do it. And so one night we were at a home group and he walked in and he said, "Hey, Rick, how's it going?" And I lost it. I just came unglued. I had a meltdown right there at home group. And he knew exactly what it was about. And that home group was a beautiful thing because it was a fairly large group. And each night they broke up into three meetings in the church basement. And one of the meetings was a 12 and 12. And he said, tonight, when I lost it and had a meltdown, he said, you're going to go into the 12 and 12 room, because he knew that night they were studying step 7. And so I went in, and there was a circle of people. There was probably about 15 people, or 15 or 20 people sitting in a circle. And it was that typical go around the room, have each person read a paragraph. And then once the reading is done, then people would spew forth and, whatever. As it was going around the room, I wasn't participating. I had a book, but every time it got to me in the circle, I would just say pass. So selfish. But then there was one point when it got to, and I'm in the 12 and 12 right now on the top of page 75. When it got around across the circle, there was a woman who read this paragraph. It was at the top of page 75, and it says this: then in AA, we looked and listened. Everywhere we had saw failure and misery transformed by humility into priceless assets. We heard story after story of how humility had brought strength out of weakness. In every case, pain had been the price of admission into a new life, but this admission had purchased more than we expected. It brought a measure of humility, and here's the kicker, which we soon discovered to be a healer of pain. When I heard those 3 words, because I'm so selfish and self-centered, all I know right now is pain in this moment. When I heard those 3 words, healer of pain, I sat up in my chair and went, what? What did you just say? I was a total disruptor in the meeting. But my home group had been dealing with this because I was honest about what was going on. And they just all loved me right where I was. And the woman, she had on a pair of glasses, and she tilted her head down and she lifted her glasses down on her nose, and she said, let me read that again. But what happened was when that meeting was over, there was a man in that room who I did not like, and he did not like me. We were oil and water. We did not get along. We never got along. But as we were walking out of that room to go back into the main room to close down the meeting, we were the last 2 out of the room. And he grabbed me by my shoulders, pushed me up against the wall, pinned me to the wall, and he looked me straight in the face. And the only thing he said was, how free do you want to be?
Yeah.
And in that moment, it even brings tears to my eyes, because in that moment, I knew he was there to help me.
Absolutely.
And he grabbed me by the hand and he took me upstairs. We were in a church basement. He took me upstairs out to the parking lot, and he opened the door of his truck, and he rifled through a bunch of papers, and he handed me a single page that was a step 7 exercise that his sponsor had given him years before. And he said, you go home, you get in your car, you go home, you walk in your front door of your apartment, you turn the lights on, you do not turn the TV on, you do not turn the radio on, you grab your 12 and 12 with a pen and a highlighter, you sit down at your dining room table with these instructions in front of you, and you follow, and I'm not going to say what he said, follow the frickin' instructions. And because it was in that moment that I knew that, what is that phrase? And I forget where it is in the literature, that we're willing to do as only the dying can be.
Only the dying can be.
Right. And I was, in that moment, I was dying. Even though I had 13 years of sobriety, I was dying on the inside. So I did that, and I went home and I did the work. I did exactly what was on that exercise. And I want you to know, and it only took about 15 or 20 minutes to do it, but I want you to know that the moment that I was finished, the pain was gone.
Yeah.
And it never came back. And this definition that Bill gave us in 72 of the desire to seek and do God's will, in that moment, I had a richer desire to seek and do God's will than I ever had in my entire life. And that has served me throughout the remainder of my time in the fellowship up to this point. But Step 7 will always have a very special place in my heart, because it did transform me, but only because I recognized I couldn't transform me.
Right. And whatever was eating you suddenly became objectionable.
Exactly.
In that moment.
Exactly.
He said it to you, and it got your attention. And what's so beautiful about that story is this, in addition to all that, what we find here is we have people that we bump into that we love and tolerate from across the street. But in our deepest moments, we have love and compassion for the suffering. I call it, no matter what our thundercloud status is.
That's right.
We'll always see the still suffering. And even if we have disagreements or not be our favorite people, we extend the hand. That's such a beautiful story. That in and of itself is such a beautiful piece of that puzzle.
So I want to ask you another question. This idea of sponsorship, you and I both are way believe in good and strong sponsorship.
Yes.
And I know you and the people you hang out with up in Oklahoma City, and you've got some strong AA up there, and we are all so blessed by it. But this idea of sponsorship, when you are taking a sponsee through step 7, and teaching them how to take it, is there like one specific thing that you always want them to know about this step, or a way and something you do share through your experience to help them better take this step?
Yes. And I'm getting ready to talk to you about that. I think it's really good to unpack the prayer, because there's this belief, here's another belief. I say the prayer, they're gone.
Yeah.
I'm pure as a driven snow. And I think an analysis of the prayer, and this is what I do with my guys, is have conversations. What we've been doing is falls along the line of the conversation I have with the guys when I sponsor them. But I always do this with them, is to unpack the prayer, because I think it, just like unpacking the 3rd step prayer, I think it's really important to go through and unpack it. What does that mean? Bondage of self, slavery. That's what that means. I'm a slave to me. And so I think it's important to unpack this 7-step prayer as well. When it talks about, I'm now willing you should have only good and bad. The first thing people say, well, why good and bad? Because heck, why does he need the good? Shouldn't I have the good? And I always remind them what my old sponsor told me way back at the first in Silkworth's opinion. He says, we can't differentiate true from false.
Right.
I don't know what's good for me, and I know what's bad for me. When I got here, I thought some things that were really good for me turned out to be really bad for me. Yeah. And some things that I thought were really bad for me, like coming to AA, turns out to be pretty doggone good thing for me. So I can't differentiate. So I give them all, because I can't discern.
Right.
So I don't try to be a discerner. I give it all. Then I pray, I ask that God now remove from me every single defect of character, but there's a qualifier, which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. And I think that's a piece we sometimes miss, because God may not remove a defect from me today if it might help Rick.
Right.
So if Rick and I are going down the street, and I see, we'll use Jenny because she's not here. Our friend Jenny. Not here. We'll use her.
We'll talk about Jenny.
That's right. We'll talk about Jenny. And I see Jenny, and Jenny asked me a question. I just lie. I just lie. And Jenny knows I'm lying. And she just blows me up. She just rips me up. And you're standing there and you're thinking, and you look at me and say, if that's what lying looks like, I don't want nothing to do with that.
Right.
And so, see, God didn't take that, even though I might be asking God to remove it. He doesn't take that because it's usefulness to you.
Right.
He allows that defect to stand because he thinks Rick needs help with that. Maybe Rick needs to see an example so that helps him move through whatever he's going through. And I believe that with my heart to be true because of the next line. And it says this: grant me strength as I go out to here to do your bidding. Because if he removes them all, I don't need strength. I've got it, right? If every one of my character defects are gone, I don't need strength. I'm pure as a driven snow.
Which we know we're not.
Which we know we're not. But if he leaves some because it's going to help Rick or it's going to help God, I'm going to need strength.
Right.
I'm going to need strength to power from him to gain the humility to know, hey, I'm being of service to God. This all happened. I think, and I know you alluded to this when you're reading the 12, I think everything that's happened to me is all about me.
Right.
It's happening to me. It's all about me. How am I going to get through this? Forgetting that every experience we have is beneficial later down the road. What we go through, beneficial to the next suffering alcoholic.
Sure.
It's the experience I'm going through now, but how can this be useful in the future? You said that. That's what that part you read in the book. Those are part of the 12. Now, how is this experience? And we see that over and over again, the family afterwards, right? These skeletons pushed down. We don't ever bring them to light, but we learn that we must to save some other family from death.
Right.
And so here's again, God may not take a defect from us if it's going to help one of his kids or be beneficial to him. And because of that, he gives us strength to go and move through that, to continue to seek his guidance and his prayer. Right. So this is about God removing defects. This is about me being willing to submit to God's perfect timing, perfect will, perfect use of my defects, and having it on his time. Sometimes I think about God's timing looks like whack-a-mole, right? We got him popping up and he hits, we hit one. But that's what causes, I believe those things is what keeps me in full surrender to God.
I want to make sure that we don't lose this, and that I want to give you the opportunity to finish it if you haven't. This idea of unpacking the prayer. Because I'm hoping that this podcast is going to be able to give people not only our experience and what has worked for us, but some suggestions on how they can do it in their own lives. So are there other pieces of the unpacking that you find beneficial?
No, that is it. When we get to that bottom part there, as I go out from here to do your bidding, grant me strength. That's the last unpack.
Right.
Why would I ask for strength if he's taking them? We ask for strength because he knows it's God's perfect time. He may not take it today. So I'll need strength. I need to be able to move through that. And I think unpacking those prayers, helping people understand what's really at play here, awakeness, entire psychic change. These all go to that. And a big piece of the entire psychic change is understanding this is God's time, not Clif's time, not Rick's time, not AA at large time. It's God's time.
Well, where I was going with that, and you didn't take the hint.
Help me.
But so, and maybe I wasn't as explicit as I needed to.
That's
be.
Okay.
In this idea of practical application of it and a personal relationship with it.
Yes.
So, as you know, your home group is very, very, very important to me.
Yes, I do.
And the reason that it is important to me is because an experience that I had at your home group, the Altered Boys in Oklahoma City, helped build the foundation to my current home group.
And I'll tell you what we do that got Rick. I know what it is.
Yeah. So now I'm going to let you do it.
So at my home group, when we have a member that gets to 7 or 3 or 7, is this what you're talking about?
Yep.
When we get a member, so if I'm taking a guy through the steps and we're at step 7, we sit down and have this conversation and we do the prayer together. But then the night of our home group, which meets on Wednesday nights, when the very first part of our meeting, and I'm just going to use Rick because he's here, we say, are there any announcements? And I would say, yes, tonight we're going to do Rick's 7th-step prayer at the end of the meeting. And if somebody else may say, yeah, we're going to do Bobby's 3rd-step prayer at the end of the meeting. And so at the end of our meeting, when we're all done and we've closed out with the Lord's Prayer, Rick, if it was his night to do this, he was on his step 7, do the 7th-step prayer. Rick would be in the middle, and the whole group of men would gather around him on our knees. And the guys closest to him would lay a hand on Rick, and everybody else hand on the man behind them, and we would be in full circle, all connected. And Rick would start us off with the 7th-step prayer, or the man would start us off with the 3rd-step prayer. And so the person that's the sponsoree, the person doing the prayer, knows that not only is God with him, but he's got a room full of men that's got him too. And it's a powerful moment for people. It was an impactful moment for you, Rick.
Oh,
Watch that.
You will never know how impactful it was. I remember, again, I'm just even being brought to tears now. I remember in that moment thinking, this is our program in action. This is what it feels like to feel God in the room, to feel God in my life. And I remember, you've got such an amazing home group, because when I walked in the door, I mean, that night that I was there, there were probably about 75 men in the room. It's a closed big book study.
That's
Every
right.
single one of the men had a book in their hand, and those books were falling apart. They were, because I've always heard that a big book that's falling apart is generally owned by someone that isn't.
That's true.
And at least of those 75 men, 70 of them came up and shook my hand and welcomed me and made me feel at home. And to have that be, and to have the closing of that meeting be that we all shared in that moment of that seventh step with that man who was taking his seventh step, it literally was the most profound experience I'd had in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous in years. And I took that back when I came home, and I shared it with the men, the other two co-founders of our home group, get in the car. And we now do that and have been for 3 years, doing that at our home group, that every time one of our members is taking their third step or their seventh step, we do the exact same thing. We put them in the middle of the room, we circle up. Well, COVID has kind of changed that a little bit.
No, I get it. I get it.
But
right.
But the intent is still there. We're building that connection, and as a group, we are collectively reminding each other that God's in charge. We're not.
Yes. During COVID, when we would have our meetings, when we had a man with third or seven, when we got to the end, we would all put our hands on the computers.
There you go.
That we had the connection still. We tried to have that connection. Thank you for that. That's I forget it because it's something we do so often.
Exactly. Well, you got to be reminded of just how powerful it is, right? So Clif, we're just about out of time. Is there, as we kind of head out, is there anything that you would like to offer up as a closing statement on step 7? Anything that you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle of humility into practical application in their lives?
Well, I think the key is just to kind of recap. One of the things I have to remember is that, what I used to hear a lot, I can, he can, I think I'll let him. And I don't know anywhere this probably applies more. That little trite saying that we have applies more than here. I have to remember that I am not with the power, but the power flows through me, that I am continuing to be a vessel. And that power alone is what can take these from me on his or her time, or its time, when I become entirely ready and I find them objectionable. Thanks for having me today, Rick. You're a blessing to AA, brother. I appreciate your service.
Clif, thank you so very much. I appreciate yours as well. And I'm confident that our listeners are going to be able to take a lot away from your sharing today.
Thank you, brother.
Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn all about our 3 legacies in AA through step, tradition, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: "We clearly see AA in 3 dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function." God bless.